It's Anthony Brogdon. It's your main man on the 1 and 2s. I'm scratching and I'm mixing and I'm rocking and I'm rolling to give you some good Black history. Oh my God, I'm on to something big and I got a good looking guy on the channel that y'all gonna like this, brother. Oh, we don't play with you at Strong Inspirations. I can't do it. And I can't play with you because it's too important. I want you to know this stuff. You know, a lot of times we say, oh man, we don't keep our history alive. No more. And that was never the case anyway, because there's been a bunch of smart people like my guest on the channel who all have given up their careers so that you know this history of some sort from across the globe. Black people have been doing it all along since day one, across the globe, and surviving and thriving in some form or fashion. Watch when you hear this gentleman's story. You're gonna like this video. Oh, you're gonna really like what he got to say. He an expert. He an expert. He got, look at this. My man's so smooth, he got a backdrop. Man, with y'all. He ain't playing. He got a backdrop. Strong Inspirations. I'm sorry to say, I'm Anthony Brogdon. Hey, I almost forgot who I am because him and I got some name in together type thing. Check it out. So do this, my friends. Hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspirations. It don't ask no information. It don't cost nothing. What it does, it let me know you like me. And I like you already. It ain't nothing you can do about it. I like you because you conscious enough to watch me. And this is mind-blowing. I had a lady the other day, y'all might know I'm in Detroit. She come up to me. She wasn't hitting on me or nothing like that. You know, her husband standing right there, so on and so forth. She says, are you the guy that got that show on YouTube, Strong Inspirations? I've been watching you. I said, yeah. She said, I like what you're doing. And then she walked away. That was, hey man, that was good for me. That made my day. And I get comments every now and then from people all over. I got some comments out of what was it? Out of Africa somewhere. Because I got people on the show out of Africa, and I got a comment out of Africa. Said, hey, I like what you're doing. And they gave me a tip of somebody to interview. I'm always looking for good folk. Come on this show. Let's plug it. All angles. So check this out. Like this video, hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up, because I know the timing is different. I just put up one. Did you see the video I put up with this lady out of Laurel, Mississippi, who she one of them Ida B. Wells types. She said, I would have given my life for this and still will. She made me cry. She's opening up a museum down there. She got the building. White guy gave her the building. He said, I've been watching you for years. Because she did a protest and the racist folks came with their guns. She said they was on rooftops and in the trees and all that stuff. We marching down the street. They had heard we coming to try to take the Confederate soldier picture down. She said, I don't even look at that darn thing. Don't do nothing to me. I wasn't there. I was just there in love. They got the gun. So then the black guy, who was a minister among her crowd, he had his gun. We got to come, prepared just in case. He put his gun down and he went to the white guy and held out his hand. And the white guy he had to shake hands with him. This is a modern day Ida B. Wells. Her name is Marion Allen. Watch her, follow her. She got a museum. Hold on. I ain't putting her on top of none of my other guests. But it was just recently I did it, and it moved me. It moved me when I interviewed Bishop Calvin Woods out of Birmingham. He said, man, I've been spit on, I've been cussed at. They call me nigga every other day. He said, I'm a bishop. They shot at me. I've been punched at. He said, Lord got me. None of it hurt. He said, but when they came to my house at 3 o'clock in the morning with them torches and them robes on, them costumes, he said, I was scared that night. He said, my family was there. They come to get him. They're going to put him up on the tree. My man said, I talked to the Lord. Lord said, all right. And he made them leave. Watch that video. I got him from all angles. Did you know, how about this? My man, I know he busy, got to go, but I got to tell you what, this one here, this is a good one. I got the great-granddaughters, two of them. They came on together, they tag-teamed me, of a black guy who was enslaved, right? My man working on the metals on the plantation and stuff and everything. He got pretty good at it. When he got his freedom, he opened up a car manufacturing company and was competing against Henry Ford. Him and his son took over. It's called Greenfield Motors. Never heard of it. True story. Got all the documents. I got the granddaughters. They showed the document. And the only way they found out is because of where the house is located. It ran into, there was a tornado or something and it blew things around. They looking around, they see these papers. They didn't even know. Watch that video. I'm not going to play with you. And my man on the show, he ain't playing with you neither. He wants you to know this. Watch out. So do that, my friends. I really appreciate it. Hit those buttons and everything. How about this? I don't say this often. You watch the show for free. If you want to, send a donation. You can do that. I can appreciate it. Watch my movie. I'm a filmmaker, and I talk about Black business. That's my angle and how we have survived. Did you know there were slaves who owned businesses? I mentioned them in the movie, and I tell you what they did. I go from 1800 to 1960. I cover a lot, but I give you little excerpts of it. And one of the last ones that I talk about, not just in my movie, but boom, in my book. Oh, and by the way, the movie is streaming on Amazon. Is in this book I wrote. Get your copy of this. This is the #1 Black business history book on the market. It's very easy to read. I don't add no commentary. I let the facts stand on its own merit. And it's over 200 of them. And the last fact in my book, kind of a lead in on my man here today, is about that guy out of my Motor City with the Motown sound, the Berry Gordy, and what he accomplished. There's no other company like his. They're still going like that. It's in my book, everybody. So get you a copy of that. And for to learn all about it and to do that donation thing, just go to my website, businessintheblack.net. And when you in business, that's where you want to be, in the black. In the red ain't good. In the black. Now, you hear me use this term strong a lot. Strong is my favorite word. I just like it. I've been saying it a long time, and maybe when I die, you can put it on my tombstone. Strong man lived here. Strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to my guest today. He's a strong soul, brother. Watch this, everybody. Come on, introduce yourself. Thank you for being on the show.
Yes, Brother Brogdon. My name is Mark Anthony Neal. I'm the James B. Duke Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University, where I'm also the chair of the department. I do research and write and talk about the history of Black music. And I'm hoping to chop it up with you a little bit today, Brother Brogdon, on Black music.
All right, I love it. Hold on, my man. Everybody, you hear what I said? I got the chairman on the show. Prestigious university. Man, he wrote a dissertation that they didn't have to read it. They said, come on over here with us. They ain't had to read this paper. That's huge. I got to talk about you just a little bit, Jeff, if you don't mind. Where are you from originally?
I'm originally from the place that we affectionately call the Boogie Down Bronx, New York. My parents are from North Carolina and Georgia, and they met, and I'm their only son, God rest them, born in the Bronx in 1965.
All right. Okay. I like this Bronx scenario because New York, one of my favorite towns, everybody. So you grew up in the Bronx. You grew up around all of that Black history? I mean, did you go over to Harlem and did that influence you some way?
Well, there's no question about that. I took my first trip to the Apollo probably when I was 5 years old. So, I got to see the Supremes at the Apollo. I got to see Aretha Franklin and King Curtis at the Apollo. And mind you, I'm about 5 years old. So yeah, I spent a lot of time at the Apollo as a kid, a lot of time in Harlem. I had aunts and cousins, all those kind of folks who had churches in Harlem. So, yeah, I spent some time in Harlem, knew at a very young age about the significance of it as a kind of cultural space for us.
Yeah, but how about this? What is the difference between Harlem and the Bronx? Is the Bronx give you a different flavor?
So the Bronx is one of New York's five boroughs, right? The centerpiece is Manhattan. And, Harlem is uptown Manhattan, if you will. So it's a little different, just like the Bronx is a little different. I'd like to say if Harlem was kind of stylish, Bronx is where they had swag. Yankee Stadium was in the Bronx with all those World Series championships, but the Bronx is also the birthplace of that culture that we know as hip hop, right? And I came of age amongst that generation of folks that were there when hip hop first started to be heard through the airwaves, and of course when hip hop was still plugged into the streets.
Okay, let me ask you this: what kind of grade school and high school was it? New York ain't predominantly nothing. So you went to a school with all the different cultures, and you got to know that.
So it was interesting, So I went to public high school. I went to Head Start, right? I was one of those first generation of kids, that were part of the federally funded Head Start program, and I went from there to a public kindergarten. But my mother, for lots of reasons, didn't want to send me to public school, so she sent me to the only all Black Seventh-day Adventist elementary school in the Bronx. So I got to go, grades 1 through 8 with classes, that were all Black. All of my teachers were Black women. So, in some ways it was like almost having an HBCU experience in a 1 through 8 experience. But then I went off to high school. New York City has these series of quote unquote specialized schools that you got to take tests in. So I went to Brooklyn Tech for high school, actually where I met my wife. And what was so unique about Brooklyn Tech, first of all, it was a big school, right? This is a high school with 6,000 students.
Wow.
That takes up a whole city block. Had 8 stories. It was an engineering school, right? So it had a working foundry. It was an amazing experience. But in terms of the student population, it was quarter African American, Black Caribbean. It was quarter white Americans. It was quarter Spanish speaking Latinos, and it was quarter Asian. So it was the most diverse, educational experience that I ever had. And it was at this kind of part of Brooklyn that hadn't popped off yet, but was about to pop off. In fact, Spike Lee's store, which he opened up once he began his film career, was right across the street from my high school. Okay. Right. And people who had gone to my high school, talking about kind of musical traditions, the great guitarist Vernon Reid was a graduate of Brooklyn Tech about 5 years before I graduated. And so many other folks who had come through, who kind of connected culture, with everything that was going on in the classroom. And, the thing about going to school in Brooklyn, for me, it was a commute every day. It was a bus and 2 trains. So, so I almost had a whole nother educational experience riding the subways back and forth, every day.
I'm sure. Now, Brooklyn, New York itself is segregated only by a block. There could be a block where there's Black people, and then the next block over there's white people.
Yeah, at least when I was coming of age, right? It's there's so much of New York City and Brooklyn in particular that's been gentrified over the last couple of years.
Yeah, yeah.
That it's the communities are segregated in different kinds of ways than it was before.
Yeah.
But like a city like Boston, Brooklyn had that element of neighborhoods, right? And you see some of those tensions play out, for instance, in a film like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, right, which spoke about how you could have, communities just change, once you move over a block or two, as you suggest.
Yeah, right. Did you did you play with a white kid growing up?
I remember playing with one white kid in kindergarten. But as I mentioned, I went through to the 7 elementary school, so I didn't go to school with any white kids until I went to high school, right? And I had a few white friends in high school, but primarily my core group were African American students, Black Caribbean students, and some Latino students, primarily Puerto Rican.
Let me ask you this. I'm going a little deep on you. Do you know where the plantation is in your family?
What, in terms of where my family was, and what that I don't know. That I'm not aware of. Right. It would have been someplace, at least from my father's side, in Georgia, right? Because all the DNA stuff that have gone back traces them, to an area in Georgia around, what my father was actually born in Thompson, Georgia, which is, about a half hour from Augusta.
Oh, really? So how did they get to they in some respects you could assume they fled that southern stuff to go to New York for a better way.
Yeah, so my father's brothers and sisters, and he was one of the younger of them, began to migrate from Georgia up to New York in the early 1950s. My father gets to New York City and in fact lives in Harlem, for a few years in 1959. My mother's family, my mother was born and raised not too far from where I am now in North Carolina. But her family moved after her father died. They moved to Baltimore in the 1940s. She had a stepfather after that, and then she moved up to New York at age 17 from Baltimore in the early 1960s.
What got you to be who you are? And I like this because I want my viewers to hear this. You grew up in that Bronx stuff and the schools. You got all good grades. How did you get good grades despite what was around you? Because I'm sure you grew up in some of that drug area. You knew that stuff. You knew what all we hear about, and then that rap music and what that talks about. That's not glorifying anything other than the lifestyle. How did you do that and still study?
See, I don't think that I'm an outlier. But definitely my parents, and in particular my mother, my parents, when they had me, they were not educated. My father dropped out of school, in the 10th grade to work. And he was, in fact, until his death, what you would describe as a functional illiterate. He couldn't read, other than being, and the marvel of his story is that he was able to navigate New York City for 50 years by, being able to know street signs and corners and all those kinds of things. My mother, who dropped out of school to move to New York, eventually got a GED. And in fact, she went to college the year before I did. Going to college, after work in the evenings. And we graduated from two different institutions, in the spring of 1987, like 2 weeks apart. But my mother always made it clear to me from the time that I was a young age, there was no question about the fact that if I wanted to be successful, I had to do it via education. I never had the option as to whether or not I was going to college or not. I was always going to college. And again, she kind of, helped me make that bet by actually going on that journey herself. And what it meant, for me growing up, it meant that I always had access to books. My parents, and I can imagine how much money it spent them, but they got these Britannica encyclopedias when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and there were the little kid Britannica, there was the junior Britannica, and then there was
that's right.
the grown ones, right?
That's right.
And I can remember starting off in those small ones and then graduating to the junior ones. By the time I was in high school, right, I was reading, the big brown ones that were in the living room, right, almost like furniture because no one in the house was reading them.
Yeah,
Right?
that's right.
But that was them making kind of an investment when they wanted me, what they wanted me to be. My mother wouldn't let me read comic books. Part of it is that she came from a very religious family, so comic books were seen as, the devil's work.
Really?
But she understood I was a voracious reader. She also understood I was a baseball fan. So she got me, subscription to Baseball Digest and all these kinds of things, right? But the piece of it in terms of who I became that I don't think they were as cognizant of is, in fact, the music piece. My father, again, who couldn't read, but he loved music, right? And music was, he worked 6 hours, he worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. Only time he was home, right? We're on those Sundays and he would wake up early. He would make breakfast as he listened to all these, gospel quintets, the soul stirrers, especially the Mighty Clouds of Joy, the Highway QCs. He finished up breakfast, do the dishes, and then kind of chill in the living room with a cigarette and a little bit of brown liquor. And that's when we started to hear all them Hammond B3 specialists, right? Jimmy McGriff, Jimmy Smith. We get some B.B. King, some Bobby Blue Bland. And so the house was filled with all this music. But when I was 5 years old, right, in a 7-month period, my father took me to see the Supremes at the Apollo. This is without Diana Ross. Both of my parents took me to see Aretha in June of 1971. That week-long stand that she did famously at the Apollo Theater. King Curtis was a musical director. And then in October of that same year, again, I'm still 5 years old, my mother took me to see the Jackson 5. And I think accidentally, right, they instilled in me this lifelong love of music, which of course then inspired my desire to be able to study it, right, as an academic vocation.
I got to go back to this. Just one more question. And I mean no disrespect in this. You sitting there and you reading these books. When I was growing up, we called you the nerd. Okay, I mean no disrespect in that. How did you overcome someone calling you? And maybe other people did that. I'm just taking liberties. Maybe other people did that, and you still was like, "And I'm a strong brother. Don't fool with me." How did you play that dynamic?
There was no question that I was called a nerd. And with that criticism, sometimes is a suggestion, right, that you're not black enough in the context.
Yeah, right. Go with it.
But I think I had so many different examples of successful black men who were educated. I had an uncle, in Baltimore who, got a degree from Morgan State, and, has been a preacher, for the last, 50 years. I have a cousin who's a few years older than me, who black woman, right, who has a PhD and now is, higher up in the United Methodist Church in the state of Maryland. Education was something that both my families valued, right? And so for me, I never saw education as being in opposition to my blackness, right? And of course, because I was a voracious reader, right, I was reading all of these black intellectuals, particularly poets at the time. I was reading Langston Hughes, Dudley Randall, the person who really captured my attention in college, the great Hakeem Abudi, right, who in the 1960s was Donnell Lee, the founder of Third World Press. I saw those folks as successful black men who were thinkers. So I never really bought into the whole idea that somehow as a bookworm, as a nerd, that I wasn't black enough. But I also have to be honest that, growing up amongst some of my close friends, right, a lot of who didn't go on to college, some of them got into, the hustling game. I mean, there's all kinds of stories we have. I think they also had a respect and appreciated my path. And I think intuitively they understood that whatever spaces they were in, right, that I didn't need to be in those spaces because I had a different path.
Oh, really? So they protected you?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that, right? And part of the protecting me, right? Because, if you're 14, 15, 16 years old, right, you don't necessarily know what protection is, right? But the jokes about, your mama might come outside,
I
right?
got you.
And
I
stuff
got
like
you.
that, I think is really the way that a 15 or 16-year-old tells you that, you probably do need to go upstairs, right? Because we might get into some shit
I got you.
that's not in your best interest.
I got you. Did anybody pick on you one day?
Nothing that was crazy. I mean, the kind of normal way that kids play the dozens with each other.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
But
yeah.
I never had to, throw my hands or anything like that, to
Okay.
protect
Oh,
myself. Yeah.
okay. Okay. So now you this guy and you formulating this, but at the same token, you listening to this music.
Yeah.
And this music is resonating through your house.
Yeah, I mean, and I listen to a lot of music, right? Because, my parents had very different kind of musical tastes. Like my mother was really into those soul men of the 70s. So, there was a lot of Al Green, a lot of Teddy Pendergrass, right? A lot of Luther Ingram, a lot of Isaac Hayes, right? And I mentioned my father was much more into kind of gospel and blues stuff. And I'm growing up in New York City in the 1970s, right? And this is like the high point of pop top 40 radio with radio stations like WABC, right? So I'm listening to that, right, on my own while my parents are listening to all this kind of stuff, right? So I think I grew up with a wide appreciation of different styles of music. There are times when my family's in the car now, right? And I've been married for 31 years. I have two adult girl daughters. There'll be times when we'll do road trips and I'll put on, what I call my Chuck Leonard playlist. And Chuck Leonard was a DJ on WABC, right? So it's a playlist of all this kind of stuff like Chicago, the Bee Gees, Elton John. I mean, that kind of stuff, but also mixed with some spinners, right? Some Dionne Warwick and, the Four Tops and stuff like that. And I call it Chuck Leonard because Chuck Leonard was the black DJ on WABC. I didn't know that too much later, right? Because
And
when
this
I
is New
heard him
York.
on,
This is
this is
New
New
York.
York. When I heard Chuck Leonard on the radio, I didn't think that he was black. It wasn't for, years later until I realized, and that was important because that created a space for me to be able to listen to this kind of music and again, not divorce it from who I was, right? So I had just this wide array of taste in music. And so even at a very young age, right, 16 and 17 years old, what I'm developing, right, is an archivist mind, right, in terms of thinking about music as a set of archives, right, and doubling down to become, right, this expert on Black music on the one hand, but also understanding where Black music is influencing in conversation with this other kinds of music, right? So you can't listen to Elton John, right, in the early 1970s and not hear the influence of Black music on his sound, for instance, right? You can't listen to a band like Chicago, right, and not hear the influences of Black music, right? You can't listen to, any range of groups, right, that have emerged, right, mainstream white groups that have emerged, the Rolling Stones famously, right, being influenced by the Muddy Waters and that generation of blues artists, right? So that's how I was able to develop and, become a scholar at the same time being a fan, right, of all of this music.
When we talk about the influence of music, it can happen a few ways, and probably one way is the words that they say in the music, and the message that they are trying to convey. The hip hop had a message of this is what we go through, but blues had a message, and also not just the message, but it also tried to do was to give you a feeling.
Yeah.
To break the stress down, so
Yeah.
on and so forth. There's a question there that for you.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about blues music, right, and what blues music represented for Black people, right, it is conscious Black music, right? It is a music that distills what individual Black folks are feeling and what the Black community is feeling if you listen to the music. In that regard, hip hop is an extension of what we might call a blues aesthetic, right? That if you want to know Black folks at any historical moment, listen to what that generation's blues music is, right? So, it might sound a certain kind of way, electrified in Chicago in the 1950s. It sounded an early different kind of way in the 20s and the 30s before it gets amplified. It sounds a different kind of way when Thomas Dorsey, right, who was the musical accompanist, the pianist, the musical director for Ma Rainey, right? He was then known as Georgia Tom, right? And he has a conversion event, right? Gives up the blues, right? Takes his real name, Thomas Dorsey, right? And it's after the loss of his wife, right? And having this child that he has to raise that famously he wrote Precious Lord, right? And the genius of what Thomas Dorsey did was to take those blues chords that he had been playing with Ma Rainey for a decade and translating them into a spiritual music, a sacred music, which is why those early generations of folks, when they heard gospel music, right, as opposed to spirituals, right, they often accuse those early gospel musicians of bluesing the spirituals, right, which is what, Thomas Dorsey essentially did. But that version of the blues then sounds very differently, right? When this young pianist, right, who was raised in Florida and is hanging out in Seattle with another young musician named Quincy Jones, starts playing around with different chords and takes that gospel sound, right, and then secularizes it, right? And I'm talking about Ray Charles here, right? Okay. And the genius of Ray Charles's music and what we now call soul music, the blues of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, is that he understood that the same people that he was up in the club with on a Saturday night were the same people that are going to be sitting in the pulpit on a Sunday morning, right? And he created a musical sound that bridged those two communities, right? And of course, the sound of soul music, right, transforms this country, right? Because it becomes the soundtrack of the Black liberation movement, what we call the civil rights or the Black power movement of the 1960s, right? That sound, right, is what they're going on in the world. And because it was so popular to white folks got to hear what the Black experiences was, right? And of course, it transforms this country.
When we talk about music and the history of it, give us an idea, and I don't know, you can be as specific in timelines. The first music, let's say, comes out of Africa. And then what happens when it gets to America?
So there are a couple of things I think that happens. There are many places when Black folks were enslaved in the South where they were not allowed to play drums, right? Because the overseers correctly understood the power of rhythm as a mode of communication. Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, right, who wrote, I think the most important book on Black music. Because of what comes after it, Blues People, right? And it's very early in the book, I want to say page 4, where in describing West African culture, he says, the spirits do not descend without music, right? Music was a critical part of the Black experience, right, from West Africa, going forward into the United States. And again, it was the use of this music, right, that then becomes coded communication, coded language, right, for folks to be able to communicate for each other, in terms of being on the plantation, right? So you could hear people singing "Go Down Moses," right? But it's not just a song, "Go Down Moses," right? It's codes, right? Where Moses might be a cave, a few yards down the road, and the singing of the song, is a messaging, right? Early, social media, where the singing of that song is a coded message for, folks to think about meeting after dark in a cave someplace to plot their insurrection, right? So there was always this kind of double entendre, this double speak, this double meaning, what my man Henry Louis Gates up at Harvard calls, right, talks about in his book, The Signifying Monkey, right, who we all know about, right, in terms of the lore. And we think about, Oscar Brown Jr.'s song from 1960, right? But this is a long narrative about the capabilities of Black music to articulate multiple points of view so that white audiences hear one thing, right? And Black audiences are hearing different messages in the context of the same music, right?
Let me ask you this right quick though. when they were on the plantation, did they let them have an instrument? Or was it just singing? I mean, could they do the banjo back in those days? Did they play an instrument?
And this is not necessarily a level of my expertise,
Yeah.
but we know there are occasions, right? Holidays where they were allowed to play music and to dance and things of that nature. But I think what's most important is that the way that, enslaved Africans, in terms of music, began to do things around rhythm by using their bodies, right? When you think about hand clapping, right? When you think about slapping, the ways that, rhythm gets maintained in the absence of instruments, right? Even in the context of the way that, Black people speak or sing, right? There is a rhythmic quality, right, to Black singing, right, where somehow in the absence of having, right, access to rhythm in traditional senses, the voice begins to mimic, right, certain aspects of rhythm, right, which is why, right, when you hear hip hop, right, when we talk about hip hop, 70s, 80s, beyond, right, think about the cadences of hip hop, right, and how devoid of melody, right, they use rhythm in their voice to be able to articulate what's going on, right? Melody, right, as we know it, becomes this other aspect of the hip hop experience known as flow, right? The ability of a rapper to use language to flow along the lines of a song, creating melody, right? In a way that's non-musical, right? They're not using a musical instrument, right? So there's just all of these different kind of elements, I think, that Black folks historically had carried in their body in terms of maintaining rhythm, that then once they have the freedom to be able to play freely in terms of instruments, to be able to sing freely, then to talk freely, we start to hear this kind of explosion of these rhythmic sensibilities, in Black musical expression.
When we talk about music, there's over the years, there's all these different titles that have come across in terms of music. Give you an example. There's soul music. There's R&B.
Yeah.
And you can name some of the titles. There, I mean, even going up to the later years, there's neo soul, New Jack City. Give us some idea of the titles of musics that and maybe some we might not know.
So this is a twofold question, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm one of those folks who will argue, that it's all Black music, right? In the sense that it's, whatever genre we name this is at this point is in conversation with what came before it, right, and inevitably will be in conversation with what comes after it. Very often the kind of titles that we give it really comes from white folks and a former recording industry, record industry, trying to name what they were hearing, right? So, and hip hop's a good example of this, right? There were not necessarily folks, who were doing hip hop in the early days that felt the need to name it as something, right? They were just doing something that was part of their culture. So, we often think about the early days of the 20th century, right? The early blues, and then we might think about Dixieland jazz, right? Okay. Which is something that's really coming. It's New Orleans jazz. Right, Black New Orleans jazz, right? That's given a label, right, in order to be able to sell it and market it. In the 20s and the 30s, they typically call Black music race music, right? To specifically attach it to, this is music made by Black people for Black people, right? That's different than what you might hear in the other market. And if we go through, and there are, I think, these things that we need to name them for what they are because they represent the moment in which they're created. So that when we talk about jazz, right, in the jazz age, right, we're talking about the 1920s and the explosion of these Black musicians, right, Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, all these kinds of folks, right, Buddy Bolden, right, who really is the father of jazz music as we know it.
Hold on, let me stop you there. I've never heard of him.
Buddy Bolden is an amazing figure, right? Because he's the person who gets identified as really being ground zero for what we know as jazz music. But he emerged in a period of time, right? He gets, put in an institution in 1908. before any recording. So there are no recordings of Buddy Bolden.
And he's
Right.
out of what area? What part of the
He's
country?
New Orleans. So he's New Orleans,
New
right?
Orleans,
There
okay.
are no recordings of Buddy Bolden, but these reports of those who heard them, including Louis Armstrong, who talks about being a 7 or 8-year-old boy in New Orleans and hearing this sound, right? Coming from the club was Buddy Bolden, right? And it's like, for him, that's what I want to do. All right. But, that gets translated to the mainstream as something that we might call Dixieland, right? But that's early jazz.
Oh.
When we talk about the spirituals, right? These songs are being sung in harmony on plantations, right? In the 19th century, right? That then gets translated, to a broader public in folks like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, right? What we would call Jubilee music, right? And this is really the Fisk Jubilee Singers, right? What they were doing with spirituals in the 1870s and the 1880s is really the first time that a large community of white folks are hearing Black music, right? Because they travel the world, right, singing this Jubilee music, right? So you could almost go from that Jubilee spiritual sound to this kind of Dixieland sound of the 10s and the 20s to this early jazz moment, right? That then becomes a big band movement, right? That, the folks that we know, the Count Basies, the Duke Ellingtons, and folks like that. At the same time, Dorsey, right, is doing his innovations with gospel music. By the time we get to the 1940s, right, there's a different sound of jazz that's occurring. It's almost radical, right? It's a militant sound of jazz. It spoke to an emergent militancy within the Black community. We, of course, call that bebop, right? And what we know from folks like Charlie Parker, Max Roach, right, who is the drummer of bebop, for lack of a better way to describe it, a young Dizzy Gillespie, right, and even younger Miles Davis, right, who then takes that energy of bebop and translates it to this thing that we call cool jazz. Right. And we often think about cool jazz in the context of the white musicians, right, who got involved. But it was really Miles Davis who's an early force, right, in this sound. And then he quickly shifts from this kind of cool jazz sound into this thing that we call hard bop, right, which again is these hard hitting rhythms, right, of jazz music, right, that's connecting to this kind of rhythmic innovation that's taking place. And at the same time all of this is going on, you could have a figure like a young Ike Turner and a figure like a young Little Richard and a figure like so many of these young musicians, right, who are taking this harder edge rhythm, right, what we call rhythm and blues music, right? And I want to make a distinction between rhythm and blues as it existed in the 1950s and this thing that we call R&B in the 1980s, right? But it was taking that kind of gospel influence of Black music with a hard edge rhythm. Right. So when we talk about the Ruth Browns, right, when we talk about the early Ray Charles, right, this is that sound of rhythm and blues. And Ray Charles essentially softens the rhythms of rhythm and blues, bringing in kind of gospel melodies, right, to create this sound that we now know as soul. And, I think the best description of the ways that lots of these styles of music exist in the same place, we typically think of soul music in the context of so much of the Black music that's produced in the 1960s. But, when we think about soul music, we're really talking about Southern soul, right? We're talking about the stuff that's coming out of stacks, right, in the South, right? Groups like Booker T and the MGs, Otis Redding. But that sound is very different from what we're hearing up in Detroit in terms of Motown. And what Motown really is doing, I would argue that Motown is doing rhythm and blues, right? They do not have that kind of hard edge soulness, right? That kind of Black music that makes you know this is Black music. Motown didn't do music that way, right? But it was still Black. Right. So in the 1960s, you got the Southern soul thing happening. You got the Motown sound happening. At the same time, the most successful Black crossover artists of the 1960s are artists like Johnny Mathis and Dionne Warwick and a young Brooke Benton, right? And that's Black music too, right? As is the music of folks of groups like the Shirelles. Right. So what you see is that, if there's a music genre in which there are Black influences, right, it's always going to push itself to be representative of the best of Black music, right? And again, 1960s still, Miles Davis does his greatest recording, records in 1959, Kind of Blue. Kind of Blue, right, becomes a blueprint for what jazz music is going to sound in the 1960s. When you think about Miles Davis's great quintet, where you have Miles Davis on trumpet, and you have a young tenor by the name of John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, another young saxophonist playing the alto, Julian Cannonball Adderley, right? And literally you get three different streams of jazz music that develop in the 1960s out of that one band, right? So Miles does his thing, Coltrane goes experimental and abstract, right, in terms of pushing towards what we call free jazz. And, you know, Julian Cannonball Adderley becomes ground zero for that sound that we call soul jazz, you know, creating a place where we later hear in the 1960s artists like Donald Byrd and Lou Donaldson that quickly becomes folks like Grover Washington in the 1970s. So it's like, it's hard to say that there's one Black music at any given time, right? There's so many different musicians doing different things. And that's why for me, you know, it's important to say, well, you know, rhythm and blues was this in the 50s, but you know, R&B was this in the 1980s. Right. You know, funk was this in the 1960s, right? But it sounds like this in the 1980s. I think that stuff is important so that we can connect artists with historical moments and all that kind of stuff. But when all said and done, for me, right, it's all great Black music, which is to say it's all American classical music.
I love it. Let me ask you this: being in education and music and the expert that you are, could a person say, like for example, jazz, there's a certain beat rhythm that you can see it on the paper and says that's the rhythm that all jazz kind of fits under? There's a certain beat rhythm. I'm not talking about the instruments, but the rhythm that says that's what blues is. There's a certain rhythm that's what R&B is.
And you probably need to talk to some of my ethnomusicologist friends, you know, like my man Guthrie P. Ramsey, right, who's actually in October dropping a collection of essays on Black music, right, a century's worth of Black music. But they clearly are, because I'm not a musician, right? I don't read music, right? I talk about the historical and cultural aspects of it, right? But there are those moments where you hear certain kind of rhythmic patterns, right? Like, you know, in terms of the chord progressions and the chord changes in the 1940s, that this is bebop, right? Because bebop is taking standard Tin Pan Alley songs, right? In some cases written by white men, right? And changing the chord progressions, changing the chords, right? To create something else, right?
I got you.
You know, the best description of it is like, you know, because one of the important features of Black music, you know, musically, right, in terms of instrumentation, is syncopation, right? And syncopation is that thing that we call swing, right? It gives Black music that swing, right? So instead of pop, 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 right, it's doing something else. It's the reason why Duke Ellington's mantra, right? Duke Ellington's mantra, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And what he's telling audiences that this music doesn't matter without that syncopation, right? But then James Brown takes that syncopation on a whole different level, right? Because what he does, right, where you're doing a kind of standard 2/4 thing, he accents, right, the first beat. Right, what we think of as an up, when you hear it, right, it sounds like an upbeat, but it's actually a downbeat, right? It's the accented one, right? And he swings the music from that accented one. That accented one that he swings, right, we now know is funk music, right? So when you hear, you know, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, right, and the songs that he does in the 1960s, he's changing the rhythmic structure of popular Black music, right, with this accented one, right, you know, what we call funk. That, of course, then gets picked up on by George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic, Rick James, the Commodores, whoever, right? And they helped to mainstream funk. Ohio Players, can't forget them. They helped to mainstream funk music, right, in the 70s and the 80s. And hip hop musically, right, is primarily influenced right, by James Brown's signature moves in terms of syncopation and funk music, right? Those are the early, kind of musical narratives for hip hop, right? And again, we go back to this idea of this blues aesthetic, you know, hip hop, right? And it's not to say that there's a lot of hip hop that wasn't, even today, obviously, what we would call party and bullshit, right? But we have to understand that there is a political importance to party and bullshit, because for working class people, right, who are being exploited in the labor force, who are being overworked, the ability to create times of leisure, to get out in the club, to get on the dance floor, to take back their bodies, there's a political component to that, right? So it's not just useless leisure, right? Right. It's an attempt for folks to reconnect as community. Think about all the kind of dance moves that have occurred over the last 50 years that are about Black community, right? Think about the electric slide. You don't do the electric slide by yourself, right? Right, you're on a dance floor sometimes with 50 different people, right? It's about the community coming together, right? A dance like the bus stop, right? Same way, right? And these kind of references to public transportation, right? Riding the bus, electric slide, being a subway, these places where Black folks, working class Black folks gathered, right? The music was an important part of that gathering, right? So when you hear the party and bullshit from hip hop in those early 70s, 80s tracks, it's about the gathering, right? And again, if you go back to Africa Bambaataa or Kool Herc and those innovations that occur, right? We talk about August 16th, August 11th, 1973 as kind of the date for the moment of hip hop. It literally is about bringing kids off the street from the dangers of the street to come together as a community, right? To be able to party together. Right. So it was only natural then that same sound, right, that brings people together in the 80s would then become politicized, right? So that when we hear KRS Swan and Boogie Down Productions, right, when we hear Public Enemy, when we hear Ice Cube and NWA, right, the music was then used to help educate and politicize a generation of young folks who couldn't hear, those narratives and Curtis Mayfieldian impressions anymore, right? They couldn't hear the earlier generation who created political music. They created their own political narratives in hip hop and what we call conscious rap.
Let me, we kind of come to a close only for timing and what have you. Name your top five songs that had the most influence on America.
Oof.
You know what I'm saying? That said, and maybe this might be one of them. What's Going On by Marvin Gaye would be one of mine, because when that what he said in that song was what was reflective of the time and moved America the most.
Yeah.
Give me 4 or 5 of them in any genre that you choose.
So I'll start with Billie Holiday's 1939 recording, "A Strange Fruit," which was a song that was actually written by a white Jewish school teacher who was affected by lynching in this country. And it was Billie Holiday who lent her voice to "Strange Fruit," this song that depicts, blood on the leaves, like one of the most famous lines in the history of American music. And it's also the song that marked her in the eyes of the federal government as someone who might be a problem, right? To the 1960s, I go to Nina Simone's "Mississippi Goddamn," right? And she tells the story herself in her memoir, "I Put a Spell on You," where she talks about sitting at home with her husband and hearing about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and not joking, but telling her husband, asking her husband where the gun was, because she was going to go out and shoot some white people. And he tells her, "That's not your way." And she sits down and she writes "Mississippi Goddamn," this scorching critique of white supremacy and anti-Black violence that effectively ends her successful commercial career. Right, she gets blacklisted. You can't buy the record anywhere. No one heard the record on the radio in that time. Those kind of supper clubs, the Copacabana, places like that, where she had been so successful for a decade, those avenues are closed down to her. So I would put that there. Definitely put Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," right, an album that, he was the most successful solo artist on the Motown label in 1971. His song, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which was released 3 years early in 1968, at the time of its release, was the most successful single in the history of Motown Records. And, there's no question in my mind that Berry Gordy was a race man. We know that he was a race man because, as he's doing all these records, he's also starting the Black Forum label, where he records marches from Martin Luther King. He records speeches from Stokely Carmichael. He records the poetry of Langston Hughes and Margaret Danner. He even records a folk album, or releases a folk album by Black Panther Party leader Elaine Brown, who's singing this folk music, in 72, 73. So he was a race man, right? But he was also a capitalist. And he was concerned that Marvin Gaye would kill his solo career by recording political music, right? But it's when he drops a single, What's Going On, goes to the top of the charts, sell 1 million copies. Marvin delivers a whole album, right? And literally creates a genre, I would argue, of Black, commercially viable protest music. After that, I got to go with Public Enemy's Fight the Power. It is, in terms of a message that's distilled effectively and efficiently to young Black folks, the idea of pushing back, right? And of course, the reference point here, song that came out 15 years earlier, right? The Isley Brothers Fight the Power, right? And Chuck D, right, who's a little older than most of his peers, knows that history and brings that urgency to this song, right? And then, of course, it blows up, when Spike Lee puts it in the movie, right? And there's a whole generation of folks, myself included, when, Chuck D says, in 1988, 1989, that their music, the goal of their music is not to sell records, but to produce 5,000 Black leaders, right? I consider one of the people that was created in the context of that music.
I love it. I got one for you. How about this one? James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud.
Yeah, that's the summer of 1968, right? And it changes everything, right? Because now, James Brown, who had been a successful Black artist, right, successful businessman, who was just beginning to cross over to the white mainstream, right? He does this song, right? And the song is amazing for a couple of reasons. One, because he records it because of an ongoing dialogue that he's having with the Black Panther Party, right? Who are saying to him, right, you are the face of Black music.
Yeah,
Black people respect you, right? When are you going to put some skin in the game, right? Politically, right? And this is the thing, James Brown had put skin in the game, right? Financially, right? And folks didn't know what he was doing,
right?
Really, in terms of building a Black business infrastructure, right? Radio stations and all that kind of stuff, right? But publicly in his music, right? You hadn't heard anything that was political, right? And this was his attempt, right, to quell the critiques, right? Put that out there, right? The interesting joke about it, James Brown was on the road all the time. So it wasn't like they would take a month off from being on the road and spend a month in the studio. He would get into a city, they would do 2 shows, he would book studio time after the shows, and so they were always working on the music. And famously, right, he needed these kids to sing background, right? And it was a bunch of white and Black and Asian American kids who were in the background singing, I'm Black and I'm Proud.
Oh, really?
So, it changes everything. Because I think once James Brown decides that he's going to push that narrative, right, it's easier to hear the Temptations sing Ball of Confusion as one example, right?
Yes.
Audiences then become more open to the sound of Sly and the Family Stone, right? So that when you get to that Stand album in 1969, right, it is probably one of the most important protest albums from that period of time.
Right. Okay, as we come to close, one more. Name some of the record labels, Black owned, and let me take away Black owned, that participated in this highly, in terms of movement music or just music in general.
I mean, if we want to start with Black label, I mean, we got to start in the 1920s with the Black Swan label. Right,
Never
Black
heard of
Swan is one of the first Black-owned record labels in the 1920s. So, there were always, right, because of the difficulty of getting white record companies to understand what Black music was, right, that there was always this desire for folks to be able to start their own labels. VJ Records out of Chicago is an important factor in that regard. They often get overshadowed
Yeah, never heard of them.
by, obviously by Motown. But the thing about VJ Records actually is the initial distributor in the United States of Beatles singles. Right. It's an interesting and crazy, dynamic here. Of course, we know Motown, right? But you can't even talk about Motown without talking about Chess Records, right? Because this is the thing about the recording industry. Post World War II, it's like a immigrant hustle. These immigrant folks are trying to figure out how to hustle into, some sort of success. And the record industry becomes one of the ways they do it, right? So when we talk about Atlantic Records, right? You can't talk about Atlantic Records without talking about the Erdogan brothers, right? These two Turkish brothers, right? Who start this label Atlantic, right? And of course, and Jerry Wexler, right? They get an Arif Mardin, right? You get these Armenian and Jewish, producers, right? Chess Records, owned by two brothers from Poland, right? Marshall and Leonard Chess, right? Who then signed all these great blues people that we talk about in terms of Chicago, blues music, right? So Muddy Waters, Willie Dixon, right? Etta James, right, starts her career recording, right? So, and I think if there's a label that has to be talked about, two labels. One is Stax, right?
Yeah.
Stax, which is created by a white brother and sister, right? The Stax is actually a combination of their names. And they sign all these young Black acts. They hire a young musician who's only 17 years old at that time, in terms of Booker T. Jones, right? And that band works on all those songs. They had the wherewithal to sign a young singer-songwriter by the name of Otis Redding, who becomes their most successful act. But the most important thing that they do at Stax is they hire a young promoter out of Washington, D.C., who had the ability to break their Southern music to urban audiences. That man's name is Al Bell. Al Bell comes into Stax in the mid-1960s, transforms their operations, including pushing them to record whole albums instead of singles. When the brother and sister sell the label in 1968, Al Bell takes over, and the Stax that we remember most, the Stax of Black Moses, the Stax of Watt Stax, right? This is all the vision of Al Bell, right? Building capacity, right? And, my thing is about archives. Stax in 1968, because of their deal with Atlantic, who was a distributor, they lost their whole archive. So Al Bell had to rebuild Stax's archive in 1968. It's the reason why we get Who's Making Love from Johnny Taylor. He brings the staple singers from the folk side and from these folk festivals and gospel music, brings them into the fold, right? And we get stuff like I Take You There. Great singers, producers, David Porter and Isaac Hayes were writers and producers at Stax, right? They produced Sam and Dave, amongst other people. Isaac Hayes says, I want to do a solo album, right? He's working on these 28 other albums that Stax drops in 1969. He says to Al Bell, can you let me at least create one album for myself? That album is Hot Buttered Soul, right? That album changes the sound of soul music going into the 1970s, right? And clearly it caught the ear of two young men who have been writing songs in Philadelphia throughout the 1960s, right? This, of course, is Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, who then signed a groundbreaking deal with CBS Records at the time, the connection there, being this, and I can't remember his name for the life of me now, Clive Davis, right? Who had signed so many of these Black acts, and Clive Davis, who writes a check for graduate students at the Harvard Business School to do a report and a study of Black music, what we now know as the Harvard Report on Black Music. And one of the suggestions in that report is that create a boutique label in which you had Black folks in position to identify artists, to market them, right? To be able to cultivate their music and produce them, but would be distributed by CBS. That label, of course, is Philadelphia International Records, right? And what Gamble and Huff do in terms of connecting the sound of Blackness to the politics of Blackness, talking about the Black family, talking about Black masculinity, talking about crime, right, in Black communities. And then if you didn't get the point in the music, you had to sit there and read that long ass essay from Kenny Gamble in the back of the album, right? And I think I think more than any label in terms of political impact and musical impact, you know, Philadelphia International Records is the most important label.
I love it. Let me ask you this. Is there a question that I have not asked you? Something that you thought you would want to say or something? No.
Brother Brogdon, we have covered a lot.
You covered a lot. Okay,
in this
okay.
conversation.
I always ask that just in case. Like, hey, man, I really wanted to get that in. Let me ask you this. Do you have a book that out yourself?
Yes, I've published 6 books.
Okay.
You know, if I had to suggest one, my first one, which is called What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture. And
you
then I would
right there with you, do you?
I don't.
You don't have any of them. Okay, we plug on this show.
Well, actually, let me grab them real quick.
Yeah, we plug it, man. I got time.
So yes, sir. This is a few of them. This is What the Music Said.
Yeah,
yeah,
there it is. Yeah, hold it down. It's right in front of you. Yeah, that's it. I see it. Okay.
What the Music Said. Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and the Post-Soul Aesthetic.
Okay.
And songs in the key of Black life for Rhythm and Blues Nation. Just to be clear.
I love it. And they're available on Amazon.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And do you have a website that people follow you at or something?
Yeah, if you go to my website, New Black Man, you can follow all my content, or you can follow me on Twitter as you do.
Yeah, right.
At New Black Man.
Okay, everybody, y'all hear that, don't you? Everybody, this is what we do is Strong Inspirations. I find these experts. And luckily they vet me a little bit and everything like that. And they decided to come on the show.
Well, let me tell you.
And then I let them do the talking.
Let me tell you, brother, what you are doing is such important work, right? Our success in this country has often been because of the independent Black media. Folks who feel the need that stories aren't being told, that we're not getting those stories in certain kinds of audiences, and cats fill the void, right? And you are filling the void.
Thank you.
Right, with Strong Inspirations.
Thank you. Everybody, you heard it. So hit the subscribe button. It's free. It don't cost no information. Hit the like button on this video. I know you liked it a lot. We could have kept going on and on because, you know, there's a whole bunch to it.
Absolutely.
Hit the notifications bell for when the videos come up. And tell somebody about Strong Inspiration. Don't be running around there thinking like you know everything and you got it here easily, and then don't want to tell them where you got it from. That's not right. So do that. And to you, my brother, I say this with all sincerity, and I mean this a whole lot. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love what you're doing and how you down there and you teaching these people this angle. And telling them the influence that we have had.
Yes.
Because no matter what you put on our neck, foot, otherwise, we're going to somehow, over time, figure out a way to get out of this.
Absolutely.
We're going to use music as a vehicle to say, this is the way to your freedom. This is the way to understand your plight. This is the way to deal with your plight. Mm-hmm. This is the way to overcome it. This is the way to relax, feel better. We did that. And maybe they didn't know that's what the real movement was.
Yes, sir.
There it is, everybody. So I thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Brother Brogdon. Take care.
Man. Okay.
Peace.
Yeah.